There's a case out of eastern Kentucky so strange, so absurd on the surface, that most people who hear the opening line assume it's an urban legend. 3 siblings vanish from a locked house without a single footprint in the mud. That's the summary people pass around for decades. A story so bizarre that mothers told it as a warning. Teenagers use it to scare each other at bonfires, and grandparents whisper it like folklore. But folklore doesn't leave real police records. Folklore doesn't leave mothers who never slept again. Folklore doesn't leave a tiny house sagging in the woods, still boarded up, still smelling faintly of coal dust and time, like a tomb sealed in memory. This is a case of the Whitfield siblings, 9-year-old Jimmy, 8-year-old Clay, and 6-year-old Nora, 3 children who disappeared in the spring of 1967. Not a trace, not a cry for help, not a single convincing theory that didn't fall apart under scrutiny. And for 58 years, that was the end of it. A cold case, a ghost story, a scar in Appalachian memory. Until last fall, until an arrest no one expected. An arrest that ripped the quiet facade off a man the town thought they knew, and forced everyone to ask how a monster had lived among them for so long. But we're not there yet, because before the shock, before the truth unraveled like old rope, the story begins with something stranger and far more chilling. Something the children whispered about in the weeks before they vanished. Something the adults ignored. A figure in the tree line, watching. A scratching sound under the house at night. A gift left on the porch that no one claimed. At first, everyone brushed it off as childish imagination. But in the recordings found decades later, old interviews, taped testimonies, abandoned journal entries, you hear the same quiet warning again and again. We saw him. Not a man. Not a stranger. Him. The siblings never gave him a name. Yet they spoke about him like a presence hovering at the edge of their small world, patient and hungry. And when you hear their mother's trembling voice describing the last morning she saw her children, you understand why this case has never let go of the people who know it. There is something profoundly wrong at its core. Something that refuses to stay buried. If you're just joining us, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the rest of the story, because it spirals deeper and darker than any cold case I've covered here. And if you want more long-form cases like this one, letting the algorithm know by hitting the like button genuinely helps this channel bring you more stories that deserve the spotlight. Now, let's go back to the beginning. To a little mining town in Kentucky. To a family trying their best. To 3 children who didn't know the danger creeping toward them. And to a disappearance that would leave a wound stretching across generations. The Whitfields lived outside the tiny coal town of Shepherd's Hollow, a place most maps didn't bother naming in the 60s. Dirt roads, hollowed-out mines, a single general store, and a schoolhouse that doubled as a church on Sundays. It wasn't the sort of place where things happened. Not dramatic things. Not newsworthy things. But disappearances don't ask permission. Trauma doesn't wait for the right backdrop. And the Whitfields, like so many families tucked into forgotten corners of the country, lived ordinary lives until the moment everything cracked. The father, Aaron, worked long days at the No. 7 mine. Their mother, Lila, ran the household with the quiet efficiency of someone who never had a break. They weren't wealthy, but they were known, respected, dependable, the kind of family neighbors waved to. And their 3 children were inseparable. Jimmy, the oldest, was bright and thoughtful. He had a habit of squinting like he was trying to understand something the adults didn't see. Teachers said he'd grow into someone important. He collected smooth river stones in his pockets and liked to line them up in patterns only he understood. Clay, 1 year younger, was the joker. A little wild, a little stubborn, fearless in the way only 8-year-olds can be. The kind of kid who climbed too high in trees and came home with scraped knees and a grin. And little Nora, the youngest, felt like the heart of the family. Quiet but observant. A tiny shadow trailing after her brothers wherever they went. She spoke softly, like her words could break if they weren't handled carefully. But the Whitfields weren't just a normal family, because in the spring of '67, something changed in that house. Something subtle at first. Something that would later make investigators pause, rewind, and listen again. It started with the noises. Scratching on the floorboards. clicking sound behind the walls, light tapping on the windows after midnight. Lila mentioned it to Aaron once, laughing nervously, chalking up to raccoons or settling wood. Aaron shrugged, too exhausted after double shifts to care. The house was old. Old houses make sounds. End of discussion. But the children started mentioning it too. Not the sounds. The man. They described him differently. But the details lined up too well to be ignored. Jimmy told his teacher he'd seen someone tall near the treeline behind their house. A silhouette that didn't move even when the wind blew. Clay told a friend someone was leaving things on their porch. A marble, a little carved stick figure, a torn scrap of fabric tied into a bough. And Nora whispered to her mother that someone had been tapping on her window at night. Tap, pause, tap, tap, like a pattern, like a message. Every time she brushed her hair before bed, she'd look at the window and ask, "Is he out there tonight?" But 6-year-olds have nightmares, right? And brothers make up stories, right? And boys in the mountains love to scare their sisters, right? Right. That's what the adults said. That's what the town told itself for decades. Until the arrest last year, when that explanation fell apart. But before we go there, let's walk to the days leading up to the disappearance. Because those days hold clues no one recognized in time. Clues buried beneath routine moments and quiet warnings. Clues that tell us someone had been watching the Whitfield children longer than anyone realized. Those who were around back then remember that spring clearly. The air smelled like honeysuckle, and the rains came heavy but warm. Mud slicked the hillsides. The stream swelled, and school let out early more often than not, because the teachers couldn't keep the kids focused when the weather grew restless. Jimmy spent that week trying to build a kite out of scrap paper and sticks, determined to make it fly higher than the treetops. Clay found an old rusted wagon and decided it was his new race car, dragging it down hills and tearing holes in his clothes. Nora carried a piece of chalk everywhere, drawing little flowers on tree trunks and fence posts, leaving a trail of faded white petals wherever she wandered. No one, not their parents, not their neighbors, not a single soul in Shepherd Hollow, realized those simple memories would become precious, almost sacred, almost unbearable in hindsight. But even in that final normal week, something was off. Jimmy complained one morning that he'd found muddy footprints under his bedroom window. He insisted they weren't his. They were too big, too wide. He showed his mother, but the rain had washed them into shapeless smears. Lila kissed his forehead, said not to worry, that it was probably just a neighbor's dog tracking around the yard. Except the neighbor didn't have a dog. 2 days later, Clay came home with a story that no one took seriously at the time. He claimed a man had spoken to him in the woods. Not from close up, from a distance. A whisper carried across leaves. "What did he say?" the teacher asked, laughing nervously. "He said he was waiting." "For what?" Clay shrugged, picked at a scab on his elbow, and said, "For us?" People dismissed it as a child's lie. Kids say strange things. Kids get attention. Kids get spooked. That's what adults told themselves then, and for years afterward. But it was Nora's words that haunted the most, because days before she disappeared, she asked her mother quietly at breakfast, "If someone takes us, will you come find us?" Lila froze, spoon halfway to her lips. "Nora, why would you say something like that?" The little girl didn't answer. She simply turned her face away and traced a circle on the table with her fingertip, like she was thinking of something far away. When Lila later told investigators about that moment, her voice broke. She said she wished she'd asked more questions. She wished she'd pressed. She wished she believed her daughter's fear instead of brushing it off. But hindsight is cruel. It always is. Friday, April 21st, 1967. Teachers remembered the Whitfield kids clearly because they left school quietly that day. Too quietly, some said. Usually Clay would be running ahead, Jimmy trailing behind him, and Nora tried to keep up with her little backpack bouncing against her spine. But that day they walked close together, almost shoulder to shoulder. A classmate later recalled hearing Jimmy whisper, "Don't look at him." Another claimed she saw someone standing at the edge of the schoolyard. Tall, thin, half hidden behind a telephone pole. But When she pointed him out, her friend said they didn't see anyone. Decades later, when state investigators revisited that witness statement, they asked if she could remember anything more specific. She tried. She dug till memories softened and warped by time. She said only one thing felt certain. He didn't move, not even a little, like he wasn't breathing. But children remember things differently. Their imaginations are vivid. Their fears blur into images. Their minds rearrange details over time. So no one trusted that memory fully. At least not until the arrest. Not until that imagined figure turned out to be real and still alive. But we're not there yet. For now, let's stay in 1967. The Whitfield kids walked home from school in the weak afternoon sun. Neighbors saw them. Several offered them rides because of the incoming storm clouds, but the boys waved them off. They took the long dirt road back home, the same route they walked every day, laughing, chasing each other, completely unaware that it was the last time anyone saw them alive. That night, thunder rolled through the mountains like distant cannon fire. The kind of storm that rattles windows and makes porch lights flicker. The kind of storm children cling to their parents during. Except the Whitfield children weren't upstairs in bed that night. Because by morning, when the house fell silent, too silent, their mother walked into an empty bedroom and felt something inside her splinter. The children were gone. And the investigation that followed would become one of the most baffling in Kentucky history. Before we continue, take a moment to tap the like button if you're finding yourself drawn into this mystery. It helps the story reach more people, which helps keep cases like this alive in public memory. Even fictional ones inspired by real-world cold cases. And if you want to hear every twist coming up, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss part 2. Because now we move to the disappearance. The event that shattered a family, stunned a community, and raised a question that will remain unanswered for nearly 6 decades. How do 3 children vanish from a locked house in the middle of a storm without leaving a single trace? If you've ever lived in the mountains, you know the way storms linger there, how thunder echoes off the ridges long after the lightning has faded, how the heavy air presses against the windows, how the world feels damp and half asleep the morning after. But on April 22nd, 1967, the morning after that storm felt wrong from the moment Lila Whitfield opened her eyes. She woke to a strange silence, not the quiet peace of dawn, not the low hum of a household stretching awake. A hollow, unnatural stillness, like the air itself was holding its breath. Later, she would say it felt like the world had paused, like something was missing, like her instinct knew before her mind did. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Aaron, who'd come home late from a double shift and collapsed fully clothed on top of the quilt. She wrapped her robe around her, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, and padded toward the hallway. And that was when she noticed the first unusual thing. The floorboards felt cold, too cold. The stove hadn't been lit yet, and the house was drafty, but this cold felt sharper, like someone had let the chill inside. As she walked, she stepped over a puddle of water that had dripped from a roof leak. Overnight storms did that. Nothing strange there, but something about the puddle made her pause. The shape was wrong, too thin, too straight-edged, almost like a smear instead of a splatter. She shook it off. Storms, leaks, cold floors, none of it meant anything on its own. The children's room was her first stop. She expected to find them tangled in blankets, exhausted from the storm. Sometimes Nora crawled into bed with the boys when the thunder frightened her. She'd be curled between them, her hair sticking in little curls around her cheeks. But when Lila pushed the door open, the room was quiet. Too quiet. 3 beds, 3 thin quilts, all empty. She blinked, stepped inside, and glanced around, expecting to find little lumps under blankets or a pillow fort on the floor. Nothing. Their shoes were lined up neatly by the wall. Their school clothes were folded on the chair where she'd left them. Jimmy's stones were still arranged on the windowsill. Clay's scratched-up wagon leaned in the corner. Nora's chalk sat on the bedside table. Everything was exactly where it had been the night before, except for the children. Lila tried not to panic. She called their names softly at first, then louder. Jimmy? No answer. Clay? Silence. Nora. The house swallowed her voice whole. She stood still, heart thumping, and tried to think logically, something she would replay endlessly in her mind for the next 58 years. Maybe the kids had woken up early. Maybe they were downstairs. Maybe they were hiding. Maybe they were playing a joke. But the dread, creeping up her spine, felt older than logic. Primal. Instinctive. Wrong. The kitchen was empty. The mudroom was empty. The back door was locked from the inside. The latch wasn't broken. The windows were shut. The storm had passed, but the world outside looked heavy, washed out, and still. Mist hovered above the yard. The trees dripped quietly. The road was a mess of slick mud. There were no footprints. None going out. None coming in. The house was sealed. Every opening. Every exit. It didn't make sense. She called for Aaron in a shaking voice he would never forget. For the rest of his life, he would say that sound was what told him something was terribly, irreversibly wrong. He bolted from the bedroom, and when he saw the empty room, he ran outside barefoot, shouting their names so loudly it echoed down the hollow. Neighbors later said they'd never heard anything like it. Not a father calling his children, a man pleading with the universe. Shepherd Hollow didn't have a police department back then. Just the county sheriff's office half an hour away in a neighboring town. By the time Sheriff Milo Hart arrived, Lila was on the porch shaking uncontrollably, and Aaron was standing knee-deep in mud near the treeline, staring like he expected to see his children wander out any moment. The sheriff tried to speak calmly, tried to ask questions, but Lila was barely holding herself together. Her hands trembled so violently she couldn't keep them clasped. He stepped into the house to examine the scene, and immediately found three things that didn't add up. First, the front door. It was unlocked. But here's the strange part. Aaron swore, and later passed a polygraph confirming that he had locked it before bed. And according to the sheriff's initial notes, there was no sign of forced entry, no scratches near the lock, no damage to the frame, no muddy prints on the porch. Either someone had a key, or someone had been inside before it was locked. Neither possibility was comforting. Second, the storm windows. All five were shut, latched, and dry on the inside. No prints, no smudges, nothing to indicate they'd been opened recently. But outside, the sills were wet, dripping, covered in storm residue. If someone had opened those windows during the night, the inside of the frames would have shown it. Yet they didn't. Third, the footprints, or rather, the lack of them. The entire yard was a swamp from the storm, mud inches deep in places. If the children had walked out during the night, even barefoot, there should have been tracks. If someone had carried them out, there should have been deep impressions. If a stranger had approached, the mud should have told that story. But the ground was flawless. The sheriff crouched, checked every angle, squinted, pressed his palm lightly into the mud to test its softness. It left a print immediately, which meant any human movement would have left a visible mark. But around the Whitfield house, the mud was untouched, as if no one had passed through it all, as if the children evaporated. Someone later described the scene as too clean, almost staged. But Sheriff Hart didn't entertain dramatic theories. Not then. He insisted there had to be a rational explanation. Flooding water could have smoothed the mud, he speculated, except meteorologists later confirmed the rain had stopped hours earlier, and smoothing like that would have required a flowing current the property didn't have. Still, it was early. Hart didn't want to jump to conclusions. He ordered deputies to search the nearby woods, creeks, abandoned mine entrances, anywhere frightened children might hide or wander. Search parties fanned out. Men shouted names until their voices cracked. Women scoured blackberry thickets despite being cut by thorns. Miners brought lanterns and checked tunnels with trembling hands. But by midday, there was still no sign of the Whitfield children. No clothing, no toys, no shoe prints, no strands of hair caught on branches. Nothing. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Around noon, while the search parties combed the hills, Sheriff Hart took a closer look inside the house. He stood in the children's bedroom, scanning every object, every corner, every surface. And that's when he noticed something he hadn't before. A small chalk line drawn near the baseboard, behind the dresser. At first it looked meaningless, just a child's scribble. But when he pulled the dresser slightly aside, he realized it wasn't a random line. It was a symbol, a circle, a tiny, perfect white circle. Inside it, 3 dots. Jimmy Clay Nora? Hart didn't know what to make of it, so he photographed it, one of the few pieces of early physical evidence in the case. The chalk circle would take on greater meaning decades later, when cold case analysts re-examined it under modern techniques and found something unexpected. But that revelation comes much later in our story. For now, Hart simply added it to his growing list of odd details. Lila refused to leave the property. She stood rooted to the porch, arms wrapped around herself, eyes scanning the woods. Whenever she heard a twig snap or a bird cry out, she'd flinch. People tried to bring her inside, but she'd shake her head, whispering, "What if they come home? I need to see them first." Sheriff Hart stayed near her for a moment, trying to coax a few more details from her in a steady, gentle voice. "Did you hear anything last night?" he asked. "Only the storm," she whispered. "No voices? No doors." She hesitated. "No doors. But," she swallowed, "I had this feeling. I woke up around 2, I think. I felt like someone was walking around downstairs. But the storm, it was loud. I thought I was imagining it." She shivered violently. Hart placed a blanket around her shoulders. "Do you remember hearing the kids get up?" "No. Did they say anything strange recently? Anything unusual?" She hesitated again. They talked about a man." Hart frowned. "A man?" "In the woods, watching them." He paused. "You ever see him?" "No," she whispered. "I thought they were just scaring each other." "What exactly did they say?" "That he was waiting." "For what?" "I don't know." Hart exhaled slowly, the worry lines on his face deepening. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "why didn't you mention this sooner?" Her face crumpled. "Because I didn't think they meant it. Children imagine things." Hart didn't argue, but inside, something cold began forming in his gut. Around 2 p.m., while search parties regrouped, a neighbor named Ruth Danvers approached the sheriff. Her hands twisted nervously around a handkerchief. "I don't want to cause a fuss," she said quietly, "but I think I saw something last night." Hart motioned for her to continue. "It was late. Storm woke me. I went to close the shutters. And when I looked toward the Whitfield's place," she swallowed, "I thought I saw a light. A flash. Near the back door." "Lightning?" Hart asked. "No," she said firmly. "More like a lantern. Very brief. Then darkness." "Anyone outside?" Ruth hesitated. "I'm not sure. The rain made everything blurry. But there was a shape, a figure, tall, standing still." "Could you make out anything?" "No, just that it was there. And then the lightning flashed, and it wasn't. Was it moving?" "No, just watching." "Did it look like Aaron?" "No," she said. "Not the same build." "Could it have been one of the children?" "No," she repeated. "Too tall." She wrung the handkerchief harder. "I didn't think much of it at the time. Storms play tricks on the eyes. But now—" Hart thanked her, wrote down the statement, but didn't show his reaction, because inside he felt that cold knot tightening again. A tall figure, standing still, watching the house. He glanced toward the woods. Was someone out there hiding? Someone who had been watching the Whitfield children for weeks? Deputies continued canvassing the property. One noticed something peculiar beneath the back door, something small and metallic glinting in the mud. A hinge pin, clean, untarnished, out of place. They inspected the door closely and realized something chilling. The bottom hinge looked slightly misaligned, not broken, not forced, just loosened, as if someone knew how to lift a door silently off its hinges from the outside in the middle of a storm. No wood splintering, no tool marks. A clean removal, the kind done by someone patient, someone experienced, someone who had either practiced or done this before. Hart crouched by the doorway, examining the pin, running his thumb across the metal. No mud, no rust, Someone had placed it back intentionally. That discovery changed the tone of the investigation instantly. This was no longer a case of lost children, not an accidental wandering, not a freak weather accident. This was abduction, and a skilled one. Investigators pieced together the hours leading up to the disappearance using what little evidence they had, along with interviews and neighborhood observations. Here's the timeline as they reconstructed it. 7:45 p.m. The Whitfield kids go to bed. Jimmy stays up reading with a lantern for a few extra minutes. 8:30 p.m. storm intensifies. Aaron arrives home from his shift, exhausted. 9 p.m. house is locked. Everyone is settled for the night. 2 a.m. storm wakes Lila. She thinks she hears someone moving downstairs but dismisses it. 2:10 to 3 a.m. lightning seen by neighbor Ruth. Possible presence of a tall figure near the back door. A flash of light, possibly a lantern, seen near the house. After 3 a.m., no additional confirmed sightings. Storm gradually weakens. 6:30 a.m. Lila wakes to silence. Children are gone. What's missing is the most important part. How did the abductor enter without leaving prints? How did 3 sleeping children disappear without a sound? How did no one see them being taken? Theories emerged, fearful, speculative, desperate, but none fit the facts. None except one. But that theory wouldn't surface until decades later. And when it finally did, it shocked investigators more than anything else in the case. That afternoon, searchers expanded the grid. The woods behind the Whitfield house weren't dense, but they were confusing, full of narrow deer paths and steep drop-offs where old mine activity had weakened the ground. Deputies found several natural depressions, which should have offered hiding places, or something worse. They lowered lanterns into sinkholes and crawled into narrow openings that miners refused to enter. Nothing. Dogs were brought in from the county over, but the rain had washed away all scent trails. One bloodhound sat down at the edge of the yard and whined, refusing to move forward. Some handlers claimed that was a bad sign. Dogs sometimes reacted that way when they sensed danger. But officially, nothing came of it. The deeper the searchers pushed into the forest, the more they noticed an eerie pattern. No animals. No birds. Nothing moved. It was as if the entire woods had been scared silent. One deputy later said, "I've hunted these hills my whole life. I've never seen wildlife vanish like that, not even after a big storm." But the strangest detail came from a miner named Eli Turner. He was sweeping the perimeter near an old drainage pipe when he stopped dead in his tracks. He called a deputy over. Inside the pipe, so faint it was almost mist, was a tiny white chalk smudge. A circle, just like the one behind the dresser. The deputy photographed it, then stared at the chalk on his fingertips for a long time. "How could this be here?" he whispered. There was no answer. Not then. By sunset, Sheriff Hart stood with Aaron and Lila. The sky bruised purple, the air thick with the bitter smell of damp earth. He had to tell them the words every parent dreads. "We haven't found anything yet." Lila broke. Aaron clenched his jaw, so hard he nearly cracked a tooth. Hart placed a steady hand on Aaron's shoulder. "We're not giving up," he promised. "I'm calling in state support. This case isn't stopping here." But deep inside, Hart felt something he didn't confess in reports. He felt watched. Several times throughout the day, he'd turned sharply, thinking he saw someone standing deeper in the woods, just a flicker of black between the trees. But every time he looked directly, nothing was there. He kept that detail quiet. After all, stress played tricks on the mind, right? By nightfall, word had spread across the county. People gathered on porches. Mothers held their children closer. Men loaded rifles they hadn't touched in years. Rumors began immediately. Someone said they saw a drifter in the area days earlier. Someone else claimed they'd heard strange whistling at night. A teenager swore he once saw a figure near the Whitfield's barn late last month. In small towns, rumors grow legs fast, and fear grows faster. But 2 rumors in particular took hold. 2 whispers that would linger through the decades. A man had been sleeping in the abandoned mine shafts. Another says the Whitfield children were taken by someone they knew. Neither rumor had evidence, but both contained a grain of truth. a grain that wouldn't fully reveal itself until the final twist of this story. If you're finding yourself pulled into this mystery, take a moment to hit the like button. It helps strengthen this community of listeners who appreciate deep, atmospheric storytelling and long-form investigative narratives. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the perfect time. Parts 3 through 8 uncover revelations that get progressively more shocking, and you won't want to miss a moment. Because in the next section of Part 2, the investigation takes a sharp turn. New clues emerge, theories collapse, and suspicion begins to fall in a direction no one in Shepherd's Hollow wanted to imagine. When a child goes missing in a small town, suspicion spreads fast, like smoke slipping under doors, seeping into every conversation. By the second day of the Whitfield disappearance, the atmosphere in Shepherd's Hollow had changed entirely. The fear that started on one porch the night before it spread across the entire county by morning. And in the center of it all stood Sheriff Milo Hart, a man trying to make sense of an investigation that seemed determined to defy him at every turn. Because from the moment he began digging deeper, every clue contradicted the last. Every assumption broke apart. Every theory died before it had a chance to breathe. This wasn't a normal missing persons case. Something had been carefully orchestrated around the Whitfield house. Something precise, deliberate, and patient. And Hart knew that if he didn't uncover the truth fast, the trail, already fading under storm-drenched mud, would vanish forever. Before dawn on the second day, the sheriff assembled a team of volunteers and deputies in the schoolyard, one of the only flat spaces in town large enough to accommodate nearly 60 people. The air was damp and heavy with fog. Lanterns flickered. People whispered the children's names under their breath. Hart stepped onto a crate to address them, his voice steady but urgent. The Whitfield children did not walk away on their own, he said. We're looking for signs of abduction. Anything unusual. Anything out of place. No detail is too small. He held up a photograph of the chalk circle found behind the dresser. This symbol was found inside the house. If you find anything like this outdoors, mark the area and notify us immediately. Some of the older miners whispered quietly among themselves. They recognized the look in Hart's eye. It was the look of a man who'd seen enough strange cases to know when something wasn't natural. The search lines fanned out again. The woods were combed grid by grid. The creek was dragged. The ridge was climbed. And then, late that morning, a shout broke through the trees. "Sheriff, over here." Hart tore through the brush toward the voice. Several deputies converged on the spot. And when Hart pushed aside a tangle of branches, he saw one of the first pieces of evidence that made his blood run cold. A small scrap of fabric. Pink, frayed, caught on a low branch near the old abandoned mining road. Lila later confirmed it, hesitantly, through tears, as part of the hem from Nora's nightgown. It should have been a breakthrough. It should have offered answers. Instead, it offered more questions. Because the ground beneath that branch, just like the yard near the house, showed no footprints. Not tiny ones. Not large ones. Not human. Not animal. Just smooth, washed-out mud, as if nothing had passed through at all. One deputy murmured, "This isn't right. This isn't possible." Another said quietly, "How does a child lose a piece of clothing without disturbing the ground?" Hart didn't respond. His jaw tightened, and he took several slow breaths. Then he noticed something else, a small smear of white chalk on the underside of the branch. A circle, barely visible, almost wiped away. His stomach dropped. Was someone marking their trail? Leaving messages? Taunting? Or was this something the children had done themselves? None of the possibilities made sense. Hart instructed the deputies to widen the search perimeter another half-mile. But the scrap of fabric, like everything else, was a dead end. No scent trail. No prints. No further signs of the children. The little nightgown fragment, fluttering in the morning breeze, felt less like a clue and more like a warning. A sign that whoever took the children was meticulous, or worse, that the children weren't meant to be found. Back at the Whitfield home, 2 investigators from the state police arrived, Officer Helen Cray and Sergeant Douglas Fairley. Both seasoned, both methodical, both known for their ability to piece together complex scenes. They began their analysis with the interior of the house. And within an hour, they made a discovery that would shift the entire direction of the investigation. Sergeant Fairley stood in the children's room, staring at something on the wall that the sheriff had overlooked. He called for Hart. "What do you make of this?" he asked. On the wall just beside Clay's bed, faint, almost invisible unless the light hit it just right, were small vertical scratches. 4 of them, parallel, evenly spaced. They weren't done by a child. They weren't playful. They weren't careless. They were deliberate, like someone had dragged a tool or nails down the paint. Hart ran his finger over them. The grooves were shallow but precise. "What does it mean?" he asked. Fairley shook his head. "I'm not sure, but they weren't made long ago." Officer Cray bent down and examined the baseboard, and there, almost deliberately hidden, was another faint chalk circle, this one larger. Messier, as if made in a hurry. A circle, always a circle. 3 times now, behind the dresser, in the woods, and now here. What the hell were these kids trying to tell us? Hart muttered. Cray didn't look convinced that the children were the ones drawing them. She straightened, crossed her arms, and said quietly, "What if someone was leaving these for them?" Hart felt a chill crawl up the back of his neck. They continued through the house. And that's when they found the next disturbing clue. On the inside of the front door, near the lock, were faint smudges, barely visible under the glare of morning light. 12 or more. They weren't fingerprints. They were knuckle marks, as if someone had pressed their hand flat, slowly, carefully, against the wood. But here's the strangest part. There were no prints on the outside of the door, only inside, meaning whoever touched the door was already inside the house. Hart stepped back, heartbeat loud in his ears. Someone had been in the Whitfield home, probably more than once, and the thought that chilled him most wasn't the idea of a stranger breaking in. It was a possibility that the intruder had entered silently, watched silently, waited silently, and left silently, a ghost in human shape. By the end of the second day, frustration and fear had boiled over. People gathered outside the general store, the church, the post office. Men with rifles walked the roads. Mothers kept their children inside, and whispers grew louder. Some blamed drifters. Some blamed escaped convicts from a nearby prison 2 counties over. Some whispered about mountain people who lived off-grid, and others, they started blaming someone closer, someone familiar, someone who had access to the Whitfield home. In small towns, the circle of suspicion always closes inward, and unfortunately for Aaron Whitfield, grief made people irrational. A rumor grew quickly. Maybe the father did it. Someone pointed out that Aaron worked long shifts underground, isolated, tired, stressed. Someone else claimed he'd seen Aaron lose his temper once at a bar years ago. Someone else insisted the lack of footprints meant it had to be someone inside the house. Before long, the whisper turned into a wave. Hart shut it down publicly. "Aaron Whitfield is not under suspicion," he said firmly. But behind closed doors, he wasn't as confident. Not because he believed Aaron capable of such horror, but because the facts were so impossibly contradictory that every possibility had to stay on the table. Cray insisted they verify Aaron's alibi. Fairley recommended interviewing him separately from his wife. Hart agreed, reluctantly, but the interviews only raised more questions. Lila's interview took place in her sister's living room, where she had been staying to rest. Her eyes were swollen from crying. Her hands trembled continuously. When asked to describe the previous night, her account was consistent. She heard something around 2 a.m. She thought the storm was playing tricks on her. She fell back asleep. She woke up at dawn. The children were gone. Nothing about her story wavered, but it was Aaron's interview that shook investigators most. Not because he contradicted her, not because he appeared suspicious, but because of one detail he gave, one detail so strange, so specific, that it lodged itself in the investigators' minds like a splinter. When asked if he'd noticed anything odd earlier that week, he hesitated for a long time before answering. Then he finally said, I thought I saw someone outside the house on Wednesday night." Fairley leaned forward. "Someone? Who?" Aaron rubbed the back of his neck. "I couldn't see his face. The lightning hit for a second, and I saw a man standing near the old oak tree. What was he doing? Hart asked gently. Nothing, Aaron said. Just standing, still as a fence post. Did you tell your wife? No, I thought I imagined it. When the lightning flashed again, he was gone. Fairley exchanged a look with Officer Cray. Hart felt his chest tighten. This was now the third independent sighting of a tall figure watching the house. The children mentioned him. The neighbor saw him. And now Aaron had too. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't coincidence. Someone had been watching the Whitfield family. But the strangest part? Each sighting described the same thing. Tall, still, unmoving, unnatural, like a statue that vanished when you blinked. By the third day, investigators gathered in the schoolhouse, now acting as their temporary command center, to reevaluate the clues. Fairley stood at the chalkboard, writing each fact in crisp letters. No footprints, no signs of forced entry back, door hinge pin, removed multiple chalk circle scratches on wall sightings of a watcher fragment of nightgown no-scent trail. The list looked impossible. Cray paced back and forth, reading each detail as if they formed a code she couldn't crack. And then she stopped suddenly. What if we're thinking about this wrong? She said. Hart frowned. Explain. Cray pointed to the list. We're assuming the abductor entered the house from outside. But what if he didn't? You're saying? Fairley began. I'm saying maybe he entered earlier, Cray said. Maybe days earlier. Maybe he was inside the house before the storm, before they locked the door. The room fell into stunned silence. Fairley finally said what they were all thinking. You mean a home invader who was inside the house? Cray nodded slowly. Hiding in closets, crawling spaces, between walls, attics, basements. Old mining towns are full of houses with strange, forgotten crawl spaces. Hart exhaled sharply. Jesus. It explains the lack of footprints, Cray continued. It explains the chalk inside the house. It explains the knuckle marks on the inside of the door. Fairley added, it would also explain why the children were talking about a man before they disappeared. Hart rubbed his eyes, overwhelmed. No, he said quietly. No parent wants to believe something like that. But the evidence fits, Cray pressed. Hart felt his stomach twist. Maybe the monster wasn't coming from the woods. Maybe he'd been inside the walls, listening, watching, waiting for the right night. Hart ordered a complete structural search of the Whitfield home. They started with the attic, empty, then the basement, dusty, undisturbed, then closets, nothing. But near the back room, once used for storage, Fairley noticed an irregular gap where a floorboard met the wall. Not big, not obvious, but unnatural. He knelt down, pushed against the edge of the board. It lifted. Beneath it, darkness. A narrow shaft, barely wide enough for a thin adult to squeeze through. Old coal homes often had makeshift repair spaces, little gaps where pipes ran or insulation had been stuffed. But this space was deeper, older, wrong. Fairley lowered a lantern. The beam hit the dirt floor. And there, half hidden in the dust, was another chalk circle, a perfect one, fresh, not smeared, not aged, fresh. The air in the room shifted. Hart felt something inside his chest go cold. Someone had been in that crawl space recently. Someone slim enough, quiet enough, deliberate enough to slip in and out without being heard. Officer Cray whispered. Dear God, he was inside the house. Hart's voice was barely audible. How long was he hiding there? Fairley didn't answer, because the real question was worse. Was he still hiding somewhere else? Hart stood abruptly. We're sealing this house, he ordered. No one comes in or out unless I say so. We sweep every inch. Deputies moved swiftly, but the dread was unmistakable. If someone had been living inside the walls, he could still be there, watching them, listening to every word, breathing the same air. As deputies swept the property, another detail emerged, something subtle but chilling. One deputy came to Hart, holding the key to the back shed. You tell anyone to lock the shed? He asked. No, Hart said. Why? Because it's locked. Tight. Hart frowned. The shed behind a Whitfield house had a broken latch, rusty hinges, and no functioning lock. It had been in disrepair for years. But when the deputy led him back there, Hart felt his skin prickle. The shed door was secured tightly with a brand-new bolt, installed recently. Silently, without permission. When they cut the bolt and pushed the door open, a wave of cold, stale air rushed out. And inside, nothing, just tools. Dust, cobwebs, empty space. But on the inside of the door, a handprint, clear, large, pressed into the dust. And beside it, a faint white chalk circle. Hart staggered back. Once again, the same shape, the same symbol, the same message. "What does it mean?" the deputy whispered. Hart didn't answer, because in that moment, he understood something devastating. The abductor was leaving breadcrumbs, not to help, not to confess, not to taunt, but to communicate with the children. By the fifth day, the search had stretched 30 miles in every direction. Investigators slept in shifts. Dogs were rotated in. Helicopters borrowed from the nearest city buzzed overhead. And still, nothing. Cases don't usually remain this clean on the surface. Even careful abductors slip. They leave traces. They leave fibers, prints, hair, scents, something. But this abductor? Nothing. Almost like he wasn't real. Almost like he wasn't human. But he was. And he'd been right there, inches from them. Finally, late on the fifth night, as Hart sat alone in his office reviewing photos, Officer Cray burst in holding a report. "You need to see this," she said breathlessly. Hart scanned the document. His eyes widened. What the hell? It was a fingerprint analysis. Someone had finally lifted a partial print from the underside of the loose floorboard leading to the crawl space. Not enough for a full ID, but enough for a comparison. And the results were horrifying. The print did not belong to Aaron. It did not belong to any of the children. It did not match any registered offender in the state. But here was the chilling part. The ridge patterns were unusually shallow, almost faded, as if the skin had been worn down, not by age, not by chemicals, but by friction, repeated, extensive friction, as if the person had spent years crawling through tight spaces. Caves, tunnels, wall cavities, hidden places. Fairly said the words no one wanted to say. "He's a minor." Hart closed his eyes. "No," he whispered. "He's something else." Cray asked quietly, "What?" Hart opened his eyes. "A man who learned to live where no one looks." He set the report down. "And he's still out there. If you're deep into this story and want to make sure more people discover it, hitting the like button truly helps the channel grow. And if you're not already subscribed, this is the moment. You'll want to be here for the twist coming. This cold case is about to take a turn no one in Shepherd's Hollow was prepared for. For 5 days, the investigation twisted itself in knots, circling clues that vanished faster than they appeared. But nothing prepared Sheriff Milo Hart for the discovery that awaited him on the 6th morning of the search. Because while the town spiraled into fear, while rumors grew into monsters, while theories rose and collapsed like weak scaffolding, something had been waiting quietly in the Whitfield house the entire time. Something that should have been seen earlier. Something that would ignite a new wave of panic and point the investigation in a direction no one could have predicted. And it all started with an old, dusty photograph pinned to a wall that had been overlooked for years. A photo that held the face of the man who would become the central figure of the biggest twist in Shepherd's Hollow history. A man that, according to every record available, should have been dead. It was Lila's sister, Margaret, who found it, not an investigator, not a deputy, not a federal agent. Margaret had returned to the Whitfield home to collect clothing and belongings for Lila. She entered the master bedroom, grabbed a suitcase, and paused to take a breath, her nerves shaky, her heart heavy. And then she noticed something strange. A photo frame, crooked on the wall. Curiosity led her closer. Inside the frame was a faded black and white photograph. Old, probably taken decades before Lila and Aaron ever married. It showed the exterior of the Whitfield house. freshly built, clean, new, likely from the early 1940s. And standing beside the house, hand resting on the porch rail, was a tall man, lean, sharp features, hollow eyes that stared through the camera. A man with a posture so familiar that Margaret's stomach clenched. It looked exactly like the man people had been describing in whispers all week. The same build, the same height, the same unsettling stillness, the same presence the neighbors saw watching the house, the same figure Aaron swore he saw near the oak tree, the same shadow the children described before they vanished. She gasped. Her knees went weak. She grabbed the frame off the wall and sprinted out the front door, so fast she nearly lost her balance. Minutes later, she burst into the schoolhouse, startling investigators as she held the photograph high in the air. "You need to see this," she said, breathless. Hart rose from his desk. Cray and Fairley rushed over. Margaret handed them the frame, and the room went silent, completely silent, because the resemblance was undeniable. Officer Cray whispered, "That's him." Hart swallowed hard. He felt something tighten inside his chest, fear mixed with dread, mixed with something even heavier, recognition. "I've seen that face before," Hart murmured, "but I can't remember where." Fairley leaned closer, inspecting the back of the photograph. And there, barely legible in faded pencil, was a name none of them expected. Caleb R., Whitfield, 1943. Fairley blinked hard. Cray drew in a slow breath. Margaret covered her mouth. "That's impossible," she whispered. "That was Aaron's uncle. He died before Aaron was born." Hart stared at the name, then at the face, and every hair on his arms rose, because this wasn't just a resemblance. This wasn't just family likeness. This was the same man, the same face, the same hollow-eyed expression, the same unnerving stillness. A man dead for decades, yet somehow standing outside the Whitfield home, the week the children vanished. Hart felt his pulse race. "It's not possible," he said quietly. But the evidence didn't care about what was possible. It cared about what was true. Margaret's hand shook violently as she lowered herself into a chair. "I remember hearing the story when I was a girl," she whispered. "My mother told me never to repeat it. She said it was bad luck." "What story?" Hart demanded. Margaret looked up, her voice trembling like a loose shutter in a storm. "They said Caleb Whitfield never left the property." Fairley frowned. "What does that mean?" "They said he went missing in his 20s, disappeared into the mine one night, and never came out again. No body, no footprints, no evidence. Just gone." Hart and Cray exchanged a look. Margaret continued, barely audible, "And people said the house wasn't right after that. They said someone kept watching it. They said someone tall and thin wandered the woods at night, but left no prints. Kids used to dare each other to stand outside the house and see if they could spot him." Hart's breath caught. A chill crept over the room like a shadow sliding across the floor. "So you're saying," Cray said slowly, "that the children's abductor is—" "What? A ghost?" "No," Margaret whispered. "Not a ghost." She pointed at the photograph. "A Whitfield." Hart shook his head. "That man died decades ago." "But there was never proof," Margaret insisted. Fairley crossed his arms. "You think a missing relative came back after 40 years? Margaret nodded faintly. "They said Caleb was strange. Liked dark places. Liked quiet. Liked hiding." Hart felt his stomach twist. Hiding. Walls. Crawl spaces. Silence. This wasn't a ghost. This was learned behavior. Survival. Adaptation. Cray spoke softly. "If he survived in those tunnels, if he lived underground, if he adapted to isolation and darkness, he might not have fingerprints anymore." Fairley added, "And he might have developed a fixation on this house." Hart stared at the photograph again. That stillness, that emptiness, that hollow expression, almost like someone halfway between two worlds, human and something else, something that lived in shadows, something that left chalk circles like breadcrumbs, something that returned home. Within an hour, The photo was scanned, copied, and distributed to every team in the field. Experienced deputies squinted at it, unease creeping into their eyes. Dead men don't return. But legends? Legends have longer lifespans. Cray and Fairley dug through old county archives. Dust thick enough to inhale. They found birth records, land deeds, and a single handwritten incident report dated March 1943, the year the photo was taken. A report written by the sheriff at the time. The words were so shocking Hart made 3 separate deputies read them aloud just to confirm he wasn't hallucinating. Subject: Caleb Whitfield. Reported missing after failing to return from work at Mine 12. Co-workers claim he was last seen entering Tunnel 6 alone. Rescue teams searched 3 days. Found evidence of habitation deeper inside the tunnel system. Candle wax, fabric scraps, marks on the stone. Due to unstable conditions, rescue halted. Family notified. Case closed as presumed dead. Then, scribbled at the bottom in a shaky hand. Something in that mine is wrong. Not natural. Recommend sealing tunnel. Fairly closed the file slowly. Mine 12, he said. Tunnel 6. That's the abandoned shaft 3 miles west. Cray looked at Hart. You think he survived down there? Hart didn't answer, because deep down he already knew the answer. A man accustomed to tunnels would understand silence. He'd understand hiding. He'd understand how to move without sound, how to avoid leaving prints in mud, how to slip through crawl spaces unseen. And he would know every back path, every ridge, every old coal road across Shepherd's Hollow. Hart stood and grabbed his coat. Get the search teams, he said. We're going to Mine 12. But Sheriff, Fairley began. Hart cut him off. If Caleb Whitfield took those children, he took them underground. They assembled a team of 9. Sheriff Hart, Officer Cray, Sergeant Fairley, 3 deputies, 2 mine rescue volunteers, and a tracking dog named Harper. By late afternoon, they reached the mouth of Mine 12. The entrance was collapsed, reconstructed, collapsed again, then gated off by rusted iron bars welded decades ago. A sign hung crookedly. Danger, unsafe, keep out. The air smelled stale, like old earth and forgotten secrets. Hart used a crowbar to break the rusted chain on the gate. The metal shrieked in protest. This mine hasn't been touched in years, one deputy said. Cray clicked on a lantern. Look again. Inside the gate, the dust had been disturbed. Not recently, but repeatedly. Patterns, trails, smudges, like someone had passed through over and over. Fairley knelt down. No prints, he said. Just impressions. Hart stepped forward. This is him, he said. This has been his way in and out. One of the rescue volunteers, a former miner with 30 years underground, shined his headlamp into the darkness. Tunnel 6 is nearly a mile in, he warned. If we get lost, we're dead. Hart looked back at the team. If Caleb is alive, he said, he knows these tunnels better than anyone. The rescue volunteer adjusted his lamp. Then let's hope he wants to be found. They stepped inside, and the light from the outside world vanished behind them. Mine tunnels have a smell, a mixture of sulfur, wet stone, and the ghosts of decades long gone. But as the team moved deeper, another scent drifted faintly through the air. Sweet, faint, almost impossible. Cray stopped walking. Do you smell that? Fairley inhaled. Is that peppermint? Hart's heart slammed against his ribs. Nora's favorite candy, he whispered. Cray turned to the rescue volunteer. How far to Tunnel 6? Another quarter mile, the man said. But Sheriff, these tunnels are unstable. If something collapses... Hart cut him off. We keep going. Minutes later, the dog Harper stopped, stiffened, then gave a sharp bark. She scratched frantically at the tunnel wall. Fairley lowered his lantern, and there, scratched into the stone, was a chalk circle, fresh, uneven, drawn by a small, frantic hand. Hart's voice cracked. They're alive. Cray felt tears sting her eyes. Fairley's voice was low. They left this for us. Hart touched the circle gently. No, he whispered. They left this because someone told them how. And suddenly a horrifying thought entered his mind. What if the children weren't being chased? What if they were being guided? led deeper, taken deeper, into the dark, into a maze no one else knew. He looked at the rescue volunteer. Where does Tunnel 6 lead? The man hesitated. There's an old chamber, he said, deeper than any of the others. The miners used it as an emergency shelter back in the 30s. Is it accessible? Cray asked. Not normally. The entrance is blocked by a partial collapse. Only someone small or someone determined could squeeze through. Hart breathed out slowly. Caleb Whitfield was both. When they reached the entrance to Tunnel 6, the lantern beams revealed a narrow opening, half-collapsed, jagged stone framing a narrow gap, barely wide enough for a child, perfect for someone rail-thin. Hart lowered his lantern, shining the beam inside, and he froze, because on the other side, just barely visible, was a small shoe print. Tiny, fresh. Cray gasped. That's Nora's, she whispered. The deputy beside her whispered a prayer. Hart felt adrenaline surge through him. We dig through, he said. It took an hour for the rescue volunteers to clear the gap enough for adults to squeeze through without risking collapse. When the final stone was removed, they shined their lights inside. The chamber was large enough to stand in. The walls were jagged. Moisture dripped down the stone. But what made Hart's blood run cold wasn't the chamber itself. It was what lay scattered across the floor. A small wooden toy car. A piece of chalk. A child's drawing on the stone. 3 figures holding hands beneath a lopsided sun. Clay. Toby. Nora. Fairley's voice trembled. This is where he kept them. Cray knelt down. This is where they've been. Hart lifted the toy car. His throat tightened. But where are they now? The chamber was empty, silent, cold, no signs of recent movement, just remnants, traces of children who had been here days earlier. But then Hart noticed something else, something that made his skin crawl, a photograph lying face down in the dirt. He picked it up. The breath left his lungs. It was another picture of Caleb Whitfield, staring, expressionless, as if waiting. Cray asked softly, "What is that?" Hart turned the photo over, and written on the back, in black charcoal, "Home." Fairley stepped back. He took them deeper, he said. There must be another passage. The rescue volunteer shook his head. There's no map of anything deeper than this. Past this point, the tunnels weren't documented. Hart felt the truth hit him like a blow to the chest. If Caleb Whitfield survived in these mines, if he adapted to them, if he became part of the tunnels themselves, then he wouldn't just know hidden passages. He might have created them. Get the drill team, Hart said, "We're going further." Cray touched his shoulder. "Milo, these tunnels are unstable. We could trigger a cave-in." Hart's voice cracked with emotion. "They're alive." He looked back at the photo, the face, the eyes, the word home. And suddenly, for the first time since the children vanished, Hart understood Caleb's intent. He wasn't escaping. He wasn't hiding. He was bringing them somewhere. Somewhere only he knew. Somewhere no one else could reach. Somewhere he believed the children belonged. The breath left Hart's chest. "Dear God," he whispered. "He's taking them back to the deepest part of the mine." Cray's face paled. "The lower vein?" Hart nodded slowly. "The old ventilation shafts. The original chambers from the 1800s. They're unmarked. They're dangerous. And they go for miles." Fairley whispered, "That place is a labyrinth." Hart closed his eyes, and he knows every inch of it. Just as they prepared to move deeper, Harper, the dog, lifted her head sharply, ears up, body rigid. Then she growled. Low, soft, dangerous. The lanterns flickered. A faint sound echoed through the tunnels, a sound that froze every person in place. Soft, slow, deliberate, footsteps, not running, not scrambling, walking, approaching. Cray's voice trembled. "Someone's coming." Fairley raised his lantern toward the narrow passage, leading deeper underground. Hart gripped his flashlight. The footsteps grew louder, closer, steady, measured, not rushed, not afraid. Someone used to the dark, someone comfortable in silence, Someone who knew these tunnels like veins beneath his skin. Hart's pulse thundered. Cray whispered, "That's him." The footsteps stopped. Silence. Absolute silence. Then, very softly, a voice drifted through the darkness. A man's voice. Calm, low, and horribly familiar. Sheriff Hart. Hart's breath caught in his throat. He swung his lantern toward the sound. But the darkness swallowed the light. Cray whispered, "He knows your name." Fairly swallowed. "How does he know your name?" Hart's hands trembled, because there was only one answer, only one chilling possibility. Caleb Whitfield had been watching him, listening, following, long before Hart ever stepped into the mine. The voice came again, soft, slow, measured. "You're too late." Cray's knees nearly buckled. Hart forced himself forward, lantern outstretched. "Where are the children?" he shouted. The darkness didn't respond. Then, a single whisper. "Home." A massive twist is about to unfold. And if you've stayed with the story this far, hit the like button. It truly helps bring this case to more listeners who love deep, layered mysteries. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. It's strange how a town can seem peaceful on the outside while its foundations quietly rot underneath. In 1967, Coldwater Ridge had been holding its breath for weeks, and by the time part 3 of the story begins, the place felt bruised, tired, exhausted from fear. Every porch light stayed on overnight. Every parent walked their kids to school. Every set of footsteps in the gravel made people turn their heads a little too quickly. And when Sheriff Malcolm Boone stepped in front of the microphone to speak that morning, the entire community could see it. He wasn't a tough, unbreakable sheriff anymore. He was a man cracking around the edges, a man haunted. You could almost hear the town ask the question silently. Where are the Turner children? Where are the Turner children? But the next part of this story isn't about the fear they already knew. It's about the fear they were about to discover. Because this is a part of the story where the truth, cold, slick, and unexpected, begins crawling out of the dark. And if you're watching this, take a second to tap that like button so more people can join us in unraveling this forgotten Kentucky mystery. It helps the channel more than you think. Now, let's go back to October 12, 1967. The sun had barely risen when Deputy Eleanor Pike walked into the station, cradling a soggy, mud-covered bundle wrapped in her coat. Every officer in the room turned toward her, her boots dripping on the tile floor, hair wind-tangled, eyes wide. Sheriff Boone watched her carefully. "What have you got there, Ellie?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she bent down, gently unwrapped the soaking cloth, and revealed what she found near the riverbank. A small shoe, children's size 9, brown leather, worn down at the heel. Sheriff Boone's breath stalled in his throat. Jacob Turner had been wearing those exact shoes on the morning he disappeared. The sheriff didn't need confirmation. The moment he saw the stitching, he knew. But what chilled him even more was what Eleanor said next. That's not all. There were tracks. Not child tracks. Adult ones, leading deeper into the woods. In that instant, something shifted. For the first time, the case wasn't just a tragedy. It was a chase. Someone had walked with those children into the wilderness, or walked after them. Either way, the woods had just become the heart of the investigation. And a heart like that, it doesn't beat quietly. Sheriff Boone called an emergency meeting. Officers, volunteers, firemen, hunters, anyone who knew how to navigate the terrain. He spread a map across the table, marking the exact spot where Eleanor found the shoe. The room fell silent, because the location was wrong. All wrong. It wasn't near the trail the children usually took. It wasn't close to their home. It wasn't even near the places they were allowed to play. This was deep into the ridge's interior. Nearly 2 miles into thick, tangled woodland full of drop-offs, caves, and abandoned mining shafts. Places no child would go alone, unless they had a reason, or a guide. Boone circled the area with a red marker. "We start here," he said. "Fan out in teams of 4. Stay in sight lines. If you hear anything, you call it in. Do not go off alone." The men nodded, but everyone felt the electric undercurrent of dread. Eleanor Pike caught Boone's eye. You think someone took them out there? Boone hesitated. Only a second, but enough. I think someone brought them. That single word, brought, echoed in everyone's stomach like a strike of cold iron. This wasn't a simple disappearance anymore. This was a hunt. While teams prepared for the search, Boone made one more stop, an old cabin near the ridge where a reclusive retired miner named Caleb Durney lived. Caleb rarely left his shack unless he needed supplies, but he'd been seen in town the day before jittery, wringing his hands, muttering something about voices in the trees. Most folks ignored him. Boone didn't. Caleb answered the sheriff's knock, eyes bloodshot, beard tangled, smelling of tobacco and damp earth. I told the others. Caleb rasped, but they didn't listen. Boone straightened. Told them what? That I heard kids crying. A few nights ago. Boone's pulse thudded. Where? In the ravine behind the old mine. Sounded like they were calling for help. But when I went to check, it stopped. Caleb's hands shook as he lit a cigarette. I ain't crazy, Sheriff. I know what crying sounds like. And these were kids. Scared ones. Boone leaned forward. Did you see anyone else? Caleb hesitated. Then something in him cracked. There was a lantern, swinging between the trees, but no one holding it, just moving, floating, like someone wanted me to follow. Boone exhaled slowly. In normal circumstances, he'd chalk Caleb's story up to nerves or whiskey. But this case had stopped offering normal circumstances a long time ago. The ravine behind the old mine. He folded that into the map in his mind. Another point, another thread. The pattern was forming. The search began at noon. Dogs barked. Radios crackled. Boots sank into damp soil. The scent of pine and river mud hung heavy in the air. For hours, nothing surfaced, just endless trees and the occasional squirrel leaping between branches. Then, at 3:11 p.m., a call blared over the radio. Sheriff, you need to get to Grid 3. Now! Boone's truck tore through the woods, kicking up leaves, skidding to a halt where the deputy stood pointing at something on the ground. It wasn't another shoe. It wasn't a piece of clothing. It was a length of rope, frayed, old, and tied into a loop. A loop Sheriff Boone recognized instantly. He'd seen it before in the barn behind the Turner family home. The rope Jacob used when trying to learn how to make lasso knots. The rope he was so proud of. And now it was lying here, in the middle of nowhere. Eleanor Pike knelt by it. This means they were here, she whispered. Boone stared at the rope like it might speak. No, he said softly. It means someone brought something from their home. Someone who had time. Someone who wanted us to find it. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Because when a kid's rope shows up miles from their home, one thing becomes painfully clear. They weren't running away. They were being led, breadcrumb by breadcrumb, a message or a warning. And as always, when things are chilling like this, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next part of this investigation. It really helps the channel push stories like this out to more people. But let's keep going. Just when the search teams prepared to move deeper into the ridge, one of the officers shouted from behind a cluster of bushes, "I've got something else." Everyone swarmed toward him. There, half buried in leaves, lay a metal lunchbox. Bent, scratched, mud-coated. It was Lily Turner's. Her mother had drawn a small heart on the front with red nail polish. Eleanor lifted it with trembling fingers. Inside were 3 items: a crayon, a button, and a torn piece of paper with a smeared black fingerprint on it. No writing, no message. But Boone knew what the fingerprint meant. Someone had touched this recently. Someone was placing these items. Someone wanted the search to continue deeper. The forest wasn't just a crime scene now. It was a trail deliberately created. And the person creating it was still out there, watching, waiting, leaving little tokens like breadcrumbs, like trophies, like someone who enjoyed the chase. Boone closed his eyes for a moment. This was no longer a rescue. This was a pursuit, and the pursuer was toying with them. By dusk, they reached the entrance to the old mine, the one Caleb Durney mentioned, black as a throat, cold air breathing out of it like something alive. Some officers stepped back. Others tightened their grips on their flashlights. Eleanor whispered, Do you think they're inside? Boone didn't answer immediately. He listened. The wind, the rustling leaves, the distant calls of the search teams. Then, so faint he wondered if it was his mind playing tricks. Something else, a muffled sound, not animal, not natural, a cry, high-pitched, fragile, human. Boone's heart slammed into his ribs. "We're going in," he said quietly. "And that's where this section ends. Standing at the mouth of that mine, one step away from the darkness that would change everything. If you're still with me, hit that like button so we can keep bringing these long-form investigations to the channel. And don't forget to subscribe so you're here when we reveal the next twist. Because trust me, it's coming. Just wait until you hear what they found inside. There are endings you prepare for, and endings that break you open. This one was both. When Sheriff Malcolm Boone stood at the mouth of the abandoned mine that night, the cold air pouring from the darkness felt almost alive, as if the mountain itself knew what lay inside, knew the secrets it had been hiding for 22 days, and was exhaling them slowly, reluctantly, like it didn't want to let them go. The search teams gathered behind him, their flashlights trembling against wet stone walls. The beam of every light vanished into a thick, biting blackness that seemed to swallow sound whole. And then they heard it again, a tiny cry, echoing, bouncing down the tunnels like a fragile heartbeat. Sheriff Boone whispered, "Kids, if you can hear us, keep calling. We're coming." He stepped inside. The darkness closed behind them like a door made of night. The first 100 yards of tunnel were simple, wide enough for 3 people to walk shoulder to shoulder, with old mining tracks running beneath their boots. But as they pushed deeper, the tunnel narrowed. The air grew colder, thicker, almost damp with age. Eleanor Pike led the second group, just behind Boone. "Sheriff," she whispered, "the air's changing." He noticed it too. A strange smell, metallic, earthy, almost copper-like. They found the source moments later. A lantern, the same one Caleb Durney claimed he saw floating in the woods. It was sitting right in the middle of the tunnel floor, still warm, still burning. Someone had placed it there recently. Boone's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a search. This was a trail. Someone was guiding them deliberately. "Stay sharp," he muttered. "He's close." The tunnel veered left, then steeply downward. Far in the distance, the cry came again, clearer now. Eleanor broke into a run. "Jacob, Lily, Eli, it's us. Call back." A faint voice responded, but it wasn't screaming. It wasn't frantic. It was sobbing. Boone rounded the final corner and froze. There, huddled near a pile of abandoned gear, was Lily Turner, mud-stained, shivering, cheeks streaked with dry tears. Eleanor gasped, "Oh my God!" "Lily." The girl looked up with hollow, frightened eyes. "Don't let him get me. Please." Boone knelt. "You're safe now. Where are your brothers?" She shook her head violently. He took them deeper. Said I was too loud. Said he'd come back for me. Boone felt something poisonous rise in his chest. Anger, fear, violent clarity. "Who, Lily? Who took you?" Her lips trembled as she whispered the name. And it hit Boone like a hammer to the spine. Because it wasn't a stranger. It wasn't some drifter. It was a man the entire town knew. A man everyone trusted. A man Boone himself had worked beside for nearly a decade. Mr. Harrow. Sheriff Boone stopped breathing. Elijah Harrow. School groundskeeper. Youth baseball volunteer. Former miner. A man with access to the Turner kids every single day. A man who knew the woods, the mine, the terrain. And suddenly it all made sense. The rope, the shoe, the lunchbox, the deliberate breadcrumbs. Harrow hadn't just kidnapped those kids. He wanted to play. The rescue team wrapped Lily in blankets and carried her out while Boone and 2 deputies pushed forward, deeper into mine toward a narrow shaft where Lily said her brothers were taken. The deeper they went, the more the mine changed, from carved stone walls to wooden supports and old rail lines rusted to nothing. The air thinned. The darkness grew heavier, denser. Finally, Boone spotted a light flickering in a cavern ahead. Not a lantern, a fire, and beside it, The silhouette of a man sitting casually on an overturned crate, whittling a piece of wood with a pocket knife. Behind him, bound but alive, were Jacob and Eli. "Evening, Sheriff," Elijah Harrow said calmly, without looking up. Boone felt something inside him boil. "Harrow, step away from the boys." Harrow laughed softly. "You've been chasing me for days. I figured you'd catch up eventually." Jacob whimpered. Eli stared with wide, terrified eyes. Boone took a single step closer. "Why?" he asked. "Why these kids?" Harrow shrugged, lazily, still carving the wood. "They were sweet, trusting. Followed me right into the woods when I told them their mama needed help. Kids are easy. It's the grown-ups that lie." The way he said it chilled the marrow of the world. Boone's jaw clenched. "Let them go." Harrow finally turned his head, smiling with a softness that didn't match the madness in his eyes. "Sure, but you'll have to take me with you." That's when Boone realized it. Harrow didn't plan to run. He didn't plan to hide. He planned to be caught. This wasn't a kidnapping. It was a confession by force. A twisted desire to be the center of the story, to be hunted, cornered, seen. But the moment Harrow stood and flicked open a knife, Boone raised his revolver. "Harrow, don't." Elijah Harrow stepped forward. "You won't pull the trigger," he whispered. "You're too good." Boone fired. The shot rang through the cavern like thunder. Harrow fell, and the mountain finally went still. Jacob and Eli were rushed out, weak but alive. The town of Coldwater Ridge held its breath as the children were returned home. And for the first time in 22 days, the Turner house saw light again. The entire town came together. Food deliveries, vigils, volunteers cleaning the property, people offering anything they could. And for a moment, it felt like the community could breathe again. But Sheriff Boone carried the weight quietly, because he knew what no one else wanted to admit. The darkness in that mine had not been created by the mountain. It had been created by a man who blended into the town for decades. A man who hid in plain sight. A man who had been trusted. And it taught Coldwater Ridge a terrible truth. Evil doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes it grows roots right under your feet. Every year after that, on the anniversary of the rescue, Boone visited the old mine alone. He never entered. He only stood at the entrance, the threshold of the darkness that nearly swallowed 3 innocent children. He would whisper a quiet promise. Never again. Because the story of the Turner children wasn't just a mystery solved. It was a warning carved into the bones of the town. A reminder that even in the quietest places, shadows can take the shape of people you trust most. And if you made it to the end of this story, thank you for walking through the darkness with us. These long-form deep dive cases take time, and your support keeps this channel alive. Tap that like button if you want more stories like this. Subscribe so you never miss the next investigation. And share this video with someone who loves a haunting story with a real emotional punch. This was the tale of the Turner children, a case once cold, now closed, and never forgotten. Thank you for watching.